So this is my thesis, Dance, the Universal Language of Storytellers. So essentially what I did with my thesis is I just went through and I had this idea or this concept that language can be a barrier as we try to communicate with one another, but people from countries all over the world and for centuries have utilized dance to tell stories and to pass down traditions. So dance could essentially be utilized more in the modern world as we become more connected with technology, like we're doing right now via Zoom. And so as we become more connected with technology, though, we still have this disconnect in language. And so I believe that dance is a universal language, and that's something that I wanted to explore through my thesis and research, to be able to tell stories and share ideas and break down language barriers and open the door for communications across cultures. So I guess like the why behind why I did this is I have been dancing since I was around 4 years old, I guess. That's when I started dancing, was when I was 4. And I started very young as like a ballerina, grew up doing that. And then I just did a lot of church productions because they're like, oh, your daughter dances. Let's throw her in this little church musical. And through that, my mother and I were invited by this woman, Maria, to dance with Christ for the Nations. And we danced with people from all over the world. And I remember a few weeks before this big conference that we were going to dance at, that there were dancers flying in from Japan and Singapore and Mexico. And as a young little middle school, elementary school age kid, I wasn't able to talk to them because we didn't speak the same language. But then we were getting up on stage doing this dance to Newsboys, He Reigns, and performing and being able to just through dance share this message with an entire audience of hundreds of people, even though we couldn't communicate with one another with words, which I was just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And my small child's mind was like blown. And so then I was reminded of that in my freshman seminar class at Washita Sacred Spaces as I got to explore the Aboriginal culture, and I asked students to come up to the front of class as we had to defend a sacred space for our final. And I remember having just some of the classmates come up and be like, okay, you're going to be this part of this story, but we're not going to tell the rest of the class, and you're going to try to act it out through dance like the Aboriginal people would, and we're going to see if the class can figure it out. And it was just astounding to me about how specific the characters were that we had given them in the presentation, and like how spot on our classmates were able to just immediately understand exactly who they were. And so then I was like, oh my gosh, this is my directed study. This is my thesis. I'm going to talk about dance and the universal language. And so that was my inspiration. So then I was like, oh my goodness, where do I even start? And so I decided to start with this defining dance. Because, okay, if we're going to talk about dance being a universal language, we have to define it first. And so in defining dance, Merriam-Webster, of course, you got to go to the dictionary first, I guess. And so Merriam-Webster defines dance as an act or instance of moving one's body rhythmically, usually to music, an act or instance of dancing, a series of rhythmic and patterned bodily movements, usually performed to music, a social gathering for dancing, a piece of music by which dancing may be guided, and the art of dancing. So it was very broad and a lot. So then I was like, oh my goodness, how am I going to define it? And so I got a little help from Encyclopedia Britannica as they got to help me break it down as I read through an article that they had. And so first, just defining dance by the function. So dance over history has served 3 main functions, and that is religious, military, and social. So in the religious aspect, doesn't matter what country or what religion it's been in, dance has been there in a variety of ways. So even within like the early Christian church, dance has been a part of prayer rituals. But then in a lot of the dances that I explore later in my thesis, dance was in like the Aboriginal religion. It was also a part of the Hawaiian religious rituals with hula, and so you see that there. Dance was also used in the military, whether that be marches or preparing soldiers for battle, or even to get them in the mindset to hunt for their prey, which I thought was really interesting. And then also social, so like courtship dancing, and then as well as coming of age and initiation and mating rituals, and so that social aspect of dance. And then you also have, okay, well, how is dance different from other patterned movement? Like you have sports and you have like the birds flying around, and like how is that dance? Is that dance? And so I'm basically saying, no, that is not dance, just because I define dance more as dance has stylization and formal organization. That's when dance becomes dance. And further with that is the intent. Intent is most important in distinguishing dance from patterned movement. There's many natural occurrences that are more entertaining and aesthetically pleasing than watching a 5-year-old on stage at a dance recital. But there is an intent behind that. And so bees buzzing about and birds circling one another can only be dance in the form of an analogy. Those animals do that involuntarily to survive. It's not meant to be entertaining, aesthetically pleasing, or a means of self-expression. So I argue that in order for dance to be called a literal dance, the dancer must be able to distinguish it as a dance or intend for it to be one. So that was just defining dance and breaking it down. So then I went on and I started to explore several cultures and where dance was within them. And the first dance culture that I explored was Aboriginal dance. So the Aboriginal people are Indigenous people of Australia, and hundreds of years ago, Aboriginals occupied all of Australia, but today there's only a few groups that remain. So the first part that I found was that corroborees is where they come together. So Aboriginal tribes come together, and these are where they perform their sacred rituals. And so at these sacred rituals is where the Aboriginal people interact with what they call the dream time. The Aboriginal people believe that man, animals, plants, and the earth are one. There was a quote from a film that I watched called Australia's Aborigines that says, "They are all manifestations of a single life force. To maintain their mystical union with nature, the people say they must look after the country. They do this through their art and many other subtle ways." So dance is one way that they maintain their religion, this dream time, and that they interact with the world around them. So the dream time is essentially not, the Aboriginal people believe that it is back in the dawn of creation, how these supernatural beings carved out the world, not necessarily how it was created, but how it was carved out. And so that's what they do with their dances, is through dance they tell the stories, and they pass down these stories and these traditions from generation to generation of the dream time. And so they can literally work themselves into a trance at times. And they say that it experience acts of primordial creativity. But also due to the sacred nature of these rituals, people from outside the community are not allowed to participate, so it's not as well documented as maybe some other forms of dance, or it doesn't have necessarily as much of a technique as you'll see with Bharatanatyam or hula that I later discuss. But essentially it boils down to that it tells stories. And even within their coming of age and their ritual dances, there's still that telling of stories. You can see here an aspect of that is that they paint their bodies, and the painting of their bodies is part of the costuming as they tell stories through dance. So that can help them to represent animals, but it can also represent their tribe and where they come from. And you can see down here another photograph of a tribe performing a dance. It's typically accompanied by didgeridoo, clapsticks are that, and then they also have songmen or elders that sing while they dance and so the dance acts out what the song is. And with that, they are some of the most esteemed members in their tribes and their communities, because the dancers and the songmen are what has kept the stories and the traditions alive for so many generations. And then so the next thing I went and looked at was Polynesian dance. So Polynesian, two areas of like the whole Polynesian islands are New Zealand and Hawaii are two areas that I specifically looked at. So in New Zealand, you have the haka of the Maori people. And so the haka is really big. It's become more popularized within pop culture, especially because it happens today at the beginning of like rugby games and stuff, but that's more the pop cultural reference that we see today. But it originated in these tribes of the Maori people, and originally when European explorers went into New Zealand, they thought of the haka as a war dance, because obviously around this time, like the mid or during like the 18th century, a lot of times when the European explorers came, they didn't have the best intents, and the Maori people knew that, and the Maori people were tied up in a lot of intertribal wars at that time. So that's how a lot of the early documentation of this dance is that it was meant for warfare. But haka is actually the generic term for both singing and dancing. And each type of haka was used to communicate something different. So it wasn't just for war. And the different types are differentiated by like the word that comes after it. So it'll say haka kori. So that is with swaying movements. So kori roughly translates to curly or curling. And so there's other ones like haka tatohu, performed in formation that resembles a wedge, and it's used for divination. And tatohu roughly translates to acknowledge or receive a proposal favorably. So a lot of times today, when people refer to haka, they're referring to haka tapa'ahi is a ceremonial haka, and it's a posture dance, and it is performed without weapons, as some of these dances were performed with weapons. But some of these dances were supposed to be welcoming dances, but that is not how the European people that documented them perceived them. One thing that was unique about this dance style is that it is performed, even in the earliest stages of it, it was always performed with an audience in mind. So it was in a square formation or in a line, but it was always performed with an audience in mind to communicate something. They use their feet to keep time, but the feet really don't move aside from stomping, and arm movements are essential in this dance for pantomime, except for it's not pantomime in the means of acting out a narration. They explain the attitudes or feelings of the words, because remember, haka also means the song that they're acting out. So they use pantomime to enact the feelings, which also this goes into hula. So hula also refers to a language. So Dr. Tangaro stated, I don't even think people notice that if there's a hula dancer, there's words. We can't dance without narrative. The language is how we communicate to our universe. People think hula is choreography. Hula is first a language that has a choreographical piece to it. So hula is how the Hawaiian people essentially passed down their language. Hula came at a time, or it's been around for years. It's what they used as their religious ritual, and it ended up turning into secular entertainment. But it played a part as in the 60s and 70s, the Hawaiian people had a renaissance in a sense. and they were trying to revive their language that they had lost in the process of becoming part of the United States. And so hula was a vital part of that, because hula was one of the very few parts of their culture that was left that had that strong tie to the language. And so hula is what the Hawaiian people use to keep their language alive, and it helped them to survive that process of colonization. So in Hawaii, they have a saying that in language is life and language is death. There's actually a hula master, Kiali Reichel, and he says that in response to what does hula have to do with language, and he says it has everything to do with language. Hula is one of the very few dance forms that requires words. All hula springs from expressing oneself physically through the poetry of the text. It's the physical manifestation of the chant. And so then I went into Bharatanatyam, because I found out that there's a lot of ties between Bharatanatyam and hula, in the sense of these over here, these hasta mudras. So again, hula uses gestures just like haka does, and Bharatanatyam also uses these same gestures to tell a story. So Bharatanatyam started as a temple tradition in Tamil Nadu in India, and they're Davadasis, these women that were married to a deity, performed these dances and told these stories in this form of like a recital or a repertoire to their deity Shiva. And so these hasta mudras helped them in parts of the story to tell their story. So this one right here, moon, and flower or eating, as well as fish, are all the same. These gestures are all the same both in Bharatanatyam as well as hula, which I thought was interesting considering they're in two very different areas, but they're used to mean the same thing in two different forms of dance. So with Bharatanatyam, it's interesting because it is a very esteemed part of Indian theater and dance, because it combines both natya, which is the word for just standard theater, like spoken word, and then it also uses nrita, and it combines them together. And so the word that they use for this is nritya, and it combines both of them. And so in combining both of them, they acknowledge that in Indian culture, that Bharatanatyam, because of its use of gesture and because of how much aesthetics is used in this form of dance, that it is communicative, and that it is not just pure dance, but it is this storytelling, this almost linguistic form of dance. And you can see here that she wears the traditional sari and jewelry as they perform, because they are part of like the temple worship, and it's traditional wedding attire because they are married to the deity. Okay, and then we have ballet. So within ballet, I decided to incorporate that because that is a form that that I guess a lot of us can relate to today, because a lot of us have seen some form of it. And so ballet originated as a social dance and like court dance with King Louis XIV of France. And so he brought it it was inspired by Italian minstrels that were traveling, and he brought it into his courts. And so then he also started the Royal Academy of Dance, and from there we get the oldest ballet company, the Paris Opera Ballet. And so ballet just continued to develop, and it wasn't until Jean-Baptiste Lully's opera Le Triomphe de l'Amour that ballet was brought to the stage. And so it was just kind of like, in a sense, an accessory to opera, and women began participating, but it still continued to evolve until the mid 18th century. We have little, Jean-Georges Novier over here, and he brought about ballet d'action. And so this is when ballet, he started incorporating mime and story into it. And he tried to prove, and I guess he succeeded in proving, that ballet could stand alone, dance could stand alone. It didn't need to be an accessory to opera. And so that laid the groundwork for early 19th century pieces like Giselle and La Sophie to come about. And so ballet just continued to evolve until it became popular in Russia, and you have Maurice Petipa, who was a choreographer who brought about the Nutcracker. And right here I believe this is Swan Lake, or maybe that's Sleeping Beauty. But he brought about Nutcracker, Sleeping Beauty, and Swan Lake, which combines classical technique and the narrative and really blended them together. And that's crazy because these classic stories are still performed today by some of the most well-known companies, but like not just in France, not just in Russia, it's in Cuba, the United States, Australia, Canada, Netherlands, Italy, England, but it's the same common stories that are told through dance, no matter what country these companies are found in. Swan Lake, Nutcracker, Giselle, Romeo and Juliet, Don Quixote, Cinderella, Coppelia, the list kind of goes on. And so obviously this is where I got a lot of my training was in ballet. But then I decided, okay, I have all this information. What am I gonna do? Okay, great. I know about all these dances. So I decided that I was going to attempt to choreograph a piece and try to tell a story. And so I created a Pinterest board because that's where all great creative processes start, is with a Pinterest board. And so I had an idea for a dance several years ago of this concept of light at the end of a tunnel, of someone just moving across a stage and taking the entire time to just try to move diagonally across the stage toward a beam of light. And so I decided to fuse that idea together with, I was like, well, I gotta add a story to that. What's the story? And I decided to add my own story, infuse my own story and my own struggle with depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts. And I decided to infuse those two things together in that concept of light at the end of the tunnel to create a piece. And so I collaborated this year with the Henderson State University's dance company in creating this piece and putting it together. And I shared with them my Pinterest board, and I shared with them my vision for the piece, and I had them improv after I shared my idea with them. And I found a piece of music that didn't have words because I was like, I just really want to try to see if the dance can speak for itself. And so then I just really worked with them. It was a really big collaborative effort. And I ended up sharing the dance at a showcase last semester. And I left the piece untitled, but we gave out note cards to the audience. And we asked them the question, what/who do the dancers represent? And what is the story of the piece? We wanted to see, could they get the story that I was trying to tell? Did it make any sense? Because I had tried to take from these ancient cultures and tried to infuse gestures and like, okay, I'm gonna put gestures in there and try to go back to that place that I was in at the time and see if people can relate to that. And so I am going to show you a clip. Fair warning, I have been told that the music might be a little loud, so be prepared. But here are some rehearsal clips of the piece. Oh, just kidding. So those are just a little bit of few clips of the piece. Those are just some rehearsal footage that I captured, and hopefully the piece will be premiered next year at the dance company's concert. But some results of that piece, the responses were just astounding. There were so many commonalities that I found. People were using the word overcome and struggle, obstacle, pain, roadblocks. They were using these words. And so, and you can see in this chart up here, 37% of people out of there's about 54 people that responded, 37% saw struggle, obstacle, pain, roadblocks. But then just like looking at the key words and phrases down here, 14 people used the word overcome, 16 people used the word struggle. And then you can see that like 7 people use something similar to these above. 8 use this idea of help or lean on others. And then you see also up here, 31.5% people / society / community, they saw this idea that these were people and that the dancers represented this. So essentially, what does all of this mean? That is a really great question to ask at this point. And I think for me, I was just ultimately astounded that language can, in fact, be a barrier as we try to communicate with one another, but people from countries all over the world have been doing it for centuries, and they've utilized dance to tell stories and pass down traditions. Aesthetic pleasure, self-expression, and entertainment sets dance apart from other patterned movement. Dance has filled a variety of functions, religious, military, to social, across cultures, and that can be seen in the Aboriginal people, haka, hula, Bharatanatyam, ballet. In all forms studied, there is an element of storytelling, no matter what function it filled. A common theme of mime and gesture was used in all forms, and I was able to carry that over in my own piece as I told a story through dance. So was I successful? The dance was successful in portraying the story that I wanted to tell. Respondents saw the story of people. Respondents saw struggle and overcoming. And I found that dance is in fact a language for storytellers, but rather than dance being a universal language, I found international to be the better word. Merriam-Webster defines international as active, known, or reaching beyond national boundaries. I've come to the conclusion that dance is an international language. So in an age of social media, live video, and travel, dance has the ability to tell stories and share ideas like hope beyond national boundaries. Okay, and at this time, I will open it up for questions. If you would like to ask questions. Does anybody have any questions? If you don't have any questions, that's okay. Okay.
I had an interesting, so what was like, I don't know if this is relevant, but like what was a very interesting interpretation from your dance that like, if you remember any, like was there one that was kind of like, I don't know,
Yeah, okay, so that's actually really interesting because so like I said, there were 54 participants or respondents, and just about every single one said the exact same, like not the exact same thing, but used the same terminology. There were 2 that I remember standing out as, I'm not really quite sure. So one of them was about flowers reacting to climate change. But I thought that was interesting because they still saw that idea of the world around them impacting how they saw struggling and they saw the world around them impacting it. So I thought that was still really interesting. And honestly, I think that's the one that really stood out to me, as I was like, they're flowers, but I was like, okay, but that's still, there's still that concept there, if that makes sense. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so if that is all, I'm going to end this meeting, but thank you all so much for coming and watching. And my thesis, which has so much more research into it because I had to like speed through all of it, but if you want to read the whole 25 pages, you can check it out on the Scholarly Commons. It'll be up tomorrow, so yay. All right, bye.